Hi, Aqua Roomers. Time for chapter reading. Well, you know, the family is sick. Mary and Laura are sick. Ma put them to bed. Oh my goodness. It was so queer to be put to bed in the daytime. And Laura was so hot. Everything seemed wavering. We talked about that word. She held onto Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. "You will be all right. Don't worry," Ma said cheerfully. Laura crawled into bed, and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with her cool, soft hand and said, "There now, go to sleep." Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She would see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night. Then suddenly, sunshine hurt her eyes and Ma fed her broth from a spoon. Something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was thinner than the tiniest thing. Then slowly it swelled till it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster. Then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could hear. There were no words, only voices. "She really has a high fever." Mary was hot in the bed beside her. Mary threw off the covers and Laura cried because she was so cold. Then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth till she could hardly drink. Then Ma tucked in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, "Go to bed, Caroline." Ma said, "You're sicker than I am, Charles." Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine. Mary was sobbing. "I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water." Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed. Laura saw Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeve with his teeth and he shook at it. Pa's head lifted up a little, and then he said, "I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls." And then his head fell back and he lay still. Jack lifted up his nose and he howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too tired. Then she saw Ma's red face looking over the edge of the big bed. Mary was all the time crying for water. Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, "Laura, can you?" "Yes, Ma," Laura said. This time, she got out of bed, but when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked and she fell down. That was the fever. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined, but he stood still and firm when she took hold of him and sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket. There was only a little water in it. She shook so with cold that she could hardly get hold of the dipper, but she did get hold of it. She dipped up some water, and she set out across that enormous floor again. Jack stayed beside her. all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held onto the dipper and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. Then she stopped crying. The dipper fell on the floor and Laura crawled under the covers. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. And here is a picture of Jack staying beside Laura. Laura has the dipper in her hand and she's crawling across the floor trying to get to Mary. Can you tell that she is sick? Jack knows. Jack is helping in the best way that he can. I don't think I ever remember everybody in my family being sick at the same time. That would be very, very hard. Sometimes she heard Jack sobbing. Sometimes he howled and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard the voices jabbering again and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and she saw a big black face close above her face. It was coal black and shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone in a thick, big mouth. This face smiled and in a deep voice said softly, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away, but the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice said again, "Drink it. It will make you well." So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose. When she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully. She was not black. She was tanned like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said. The fat woman brought it at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better. She looked at Mary asleep beside her, and she looked at Pa and Ma asleep in the big bed. Jack lay half asleep on the floor. Laura looked again at the fat woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "Now there, you feel better, don't you?" "Do you remember Mr. Scott? He helped Pa dig the well. That's Mrs. Scott." "Yes, thank you," Laura said politely, and the woman brought her a cup of hot Prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good child," she said. Laura drank every drop of the good broth. "Now, go to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything till you're all well." Next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up, and Mrs. Scott said she must stay in bed until the doctor came. She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary. Then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitterness out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the powder, but she could not swallow the bitterness. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man. Laura had never seen a black man before, and she could not take her eyes off Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. Remember, we've talked about how sometimes people are afraid if somebody is different. But she knew already that Dr. Tan was kind. He smiled at her with his big white teeth. He talked with Ma and Pa and laughed a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry away. Mrs. Scott said all the settlers up and down the creek had fever and ache. There were not enough well people to take care of the sick, and she had been going from house to house, working night and day. "It's a wonder you ever lived through," she said, "all of you down at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them?" She didn't know. Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers, never let anyone near the house until Pa or Ma told him to, had gone to meet Dr. Tan and begged him to come in. Jack knew. Jack went to Dr. Tan, begged him to come in. And here you all were, more dead than alive, Mrs. Scott said. Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came. Now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all the sickness came from eating watermelons. She said, "I've said 100 times, if I have said once, that watermelons—" "What's that?" Pa exclaimed. "Who's got a watermelon?" Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms. But I want to show you a picture. There's Dr. Tan, and he was a doctor with the Indians. And there's Mrs. Scott, and Ma and Pa are sick in bed. Imagine Jack. See, dogs are so smart. So imagine Jack never liked a stranger, but Jack knew that his family needed help. And as soon as Dr. Tan walked by the house, Jack begged him to come in. Dogs are smart. Yeah, they're wonderful. So, Mrs. Scott had said one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those melons was sick that very minute. She said she'd warned them, but no, she said, there was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they're paying for it. "I haven't had a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup," said Pa. The next day, he was out of bed. The next day, Laura was up. Then Ma got up, and then Mary. They were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her, and Mrs. Scott said, "Oh, pshaw, what are neighbors for but to help each other out?" Yes, So we'll read more the next day. Thank you, Aqua Roomers.